Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland. This video will be a turncoat debate about the motion this House welcomes the rise of China. A turncoat debate is where I have to argue for the motion and subsequently against it. So, there'll be no more ado. Here we go. Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen of the House, this House welcomes the rise of China for many reasons. First of all, it's enriching the world. Second of all, the rise of China is ensuring we have world peace. Thirdly, because China is a positive influence in promoting law and justice around the globe. And fourth of all, because we need a multipolar world to stop the viciousness of Western imperialism. So, since China embraced capitalism in 1980, it's had turbocharged economic growth, double-digit economic growth in many years. So that has lifted so many people out of penury. It's only in the 60s where there were famines that killed millions of people in China. But no longer the case. It's a middle-income country, rising soon to be a high-income country, and that enriches the globe, not just China. But trade is good for both the buyer and the seller. That's why a lot of consumer goods are much more affordable around the world. And you know, people in Africa can buy things they wouldn't be able to afford previously, radios and televisions and so on, manufactured in China, people in Europe getting cheaper clothes, and the Chinese are buying more goods from abroad. So this actually makes us all better off, all happier, and as Aristotle would have said, that it's actually commerce ensures us peace in the longer run. But that leads on to peace then. So China, despite her might, has striven to resolve issues peaceably. For instance, the renegade province of Taiwan, which is indubitably a part of China. And China could very easily have resolved this militarily, but no, the Chinese have stayed their hand. They have been incredibly tolerant, and their forbearance really is a shining example to us all of just how restrained they are. Likewise, their border dispute with India, there was a brief clash in 1961. The People's Republic of China has not used force against India, and it's resolved its border disagreement with Pakistan peacefully, with the Pakistanis agreeing that the Chinese are right, and China has been such an influence for peace in relation to the People's Democratic Republic of Korea. Were it not for the Chinese, there would have been a nuclear war by now. And on and on. The examples of this are myriad, helping to resolve the Vietnam and Cambodia conflicts. We could be here all day. So the Chinese peacekeepers abroad, the Chinese Navy has been putting paid to piracy in the Straits of Malacca, in the Indian Ocean, and on and on. And China's always striven for a peaceful resolution of various disputes about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, about the putative nuclear arms program in Iran, about the Afghan conflict. And, you know, everyone else would take a leaf out of their book. The Chinese have shown us the way forward to strive to settle these issues without shedding blood. And the Chinese, being such an enormous country, having such an enormous arsenal, could easily win, but they choose not to, precisely because they're peace-loving and precisely because they're so gentle. So talk about human rights. There's been the Beijing Declaration of Human Rights, and the Chinese respect human rights much more so than many other countries. It's not a dictatorship. It's simply impossible to run such a gigantic country like that. So yes, they want strong government, fairly centralized government, because they had a century of upheaval and anarchy. You know, the Taiping Rebellion, the Opium Wars, the unequal treaties. They suffered the depredations of Occidental colonialism, the British, the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Austro-Hungarians, the Americans, and so on, relentlessly attacking them, attacking like wolves and stealing their land and all that. So they're never having that again. And fomenting internal dissent of civil wars, of gangsterism, of warlordism, of forcing the Chinese to take opium and so on. So that's why China wants to tackle these problems and has met with a great deal of success. And yes, they take a very firm approach to drug dealing, and if only Western countries would follow suit, then we could cut drug deaths to almost nil, we could radically reduce crime, we could stop the spread of AIDS and all that. So the Chinese actually grasp the nettle. They don't mess around. We've got to respect them for that. They mean what they say. When they say, if you traffic drugs in China, you will be killed. They are not joking, and they will impose that on you, no matter what your nationality. And we ought to take a similarly robust approach in the Western Hemisphere. So the Chinese will not tolerate splitism. They do what any other other country has the right to do, which is to prevent the secession of regions like Tibet and Xinjiang and so on, and they re-educate those who've been misguided, such as many Uyghurs. And that's so benevolent of Beijing to help these people come to see the light, come to appreciate the myriad benefits of belonging to the People's Republic of China. So China has led to there being a multipolar world. China is a superpower. She has bases abroad and set up military bases in the South China Sea, which she's absolutely entitled to do, and forging cordial relations with many African countries, hosting her own African conference each year, and not poking her nose into the domestic affairs of these African countries, is respecting their sovereignty. And actually, Western imperialists ought to do the same and stop interfering in the internal matters of their erstwhile colonies. The growing strength of China will probably reduce US aggression and UK aggression around the world, who abuse the notions of human rights in order to create a bogus excuse to launch these onslaughts against countries such as Iraq. You know, it really is a sick joke that the Americans should claim they care about human rights when they tortured people so monstrously in Abu Ghraib, when they waterboarded people by the hundred, and when they kidnapped people from Afghanistan, including children, and held them without trial in Guantanamo Bay for, is it 17 years now, in the torture camp. So China has never done anything remotely like this. And so that's why it's actually China is defending human rights and preventing these wars which otherwise would slay millions. So for the foregoing reasons, I beg to propose. Right, now, I'm going to be the opposition. So, Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen of the House, this House does not welcome the rise of China for several reasons. First of all, we're not remotely xenophobic. We like and respect the Chinese people. We want them to have a better life. What we oppose is this viciously oppressive regime in Beijing, which has been ripping off the people for decades. It's got labour camps, Lao Gai. The very word labour camp ought to send shudders down your spine. People are subjected to re-education. Obviously that means brainwashing, forced labour in the most abysmal conditions. It's grossly inhumane. It's redolent of the worst totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, of which Mao Zedong presided over one of them, which he deliberately killed about 20 million people in China. The Communist Party supposedly trying to help the poor. Well, it did reduce poverty, I suppose, by starving people to death, because once they were dead, they were no longer poor. And these people still can't criticise them in China. That says it all, really. So we feel sorry for Chinese people who suffer like this. We don't want anyone to suffer. We'd like it to be a free country, okay? They can find their own path to democracy. There's racism towards the ethnic minorities like the Uyghurs, and religious minorities. The Uyghurs are mostly Muslims. So no people should be locked up for not having done anything wrong, to be deracinated, to have their culture degraded and taken away from them. It's a sort of a soft genocide. It's an outright attack on their identity. The same has taken place with the Tibetans, and they've been tortured on an absolutely industrial scale. Now, I know that other countries aren't blameless. The United Kingdom, the United States and so on, they've also done bad things, not as severe and not on this scale. So it doesn't mean I'm defending the record of another country if I critique the Chinese government. So there's brutality against the Falun Gong religious organization. You don't have to believe in that faith to say that nobody should be discriminated against and persecuted for his or her religious belief. How about freedom of conscience, freedom of expression? And they're not allowed to do that. And obviously Huawei, this Chinese technology and communication company, is spying around the world. And it's in Chinese law that they are obliged to help their government spy around the world. The one-child policy, well, it was voluntary. That would be obviously something to praise, but there were forced abortions in the millions, and some people were born and illegally, they weren't registered, they couldn't even buy a train ticket because officially they didn't exist. So that was a grossly unjust and inhumane thing to do. The death penalty is practiced on a huge scale in China. The actual figure is a state secret, and that shows what it's like. That's the default setting, is secrecy. Why not? People have the right to know. People have the right to know who's being killed and so on. What happened to open justice? So thousands of people executed without fair trials for actually quite trifling crimes. So land grabbing in the South China Sea, in the Philippines' territorial waters, building these artificial islands is a very worrying trend, and propping up filthy regimes around the world, using North Korea as a weapon. It's a problem for the United States that that China can turn up or turn down in order to secure concessions from the Americans in other areas. So there they are, backing easily the cruelest regime on earth, this absolutely monstrous regime, which again had deliberately starved millions of its people to death as recently as the 90s, and practices this absurd and demented cult of the personality, is very troubling. So kidnapping dissidents abroad, people who simply speak out, will be languishing for years in a fetid dungeon. It's as shocking as can be. It's such an unfree regime. And of course there's this terrible level of pollution in China. You wouldn't be able to see your hand in front of your face in some places. And what's anything worth if you can't breathe? So many people die prematurely due to cancer. Some people live in semi-slavery. They're not to be paid at the end of the year. Then they're just not paid. Of course, there are many good Chinese people. There are many honest Chinese business executives who treat people decently. But those who don't, they get away with it, and the environment is terribly degraded. So there's a lot of people trafficking going on, and of course many Chinese people would be just as disgusted by this as I am. As I say, I'm absolutely not anti-Chinese. I just want to prevent suffering in China as well as everywhere else. And the Chinese government would sell weapons to the most malevolent regimes around the world, like the brutal dictatorship in Sudan, which is carrying out genocide in Darfur, because the Chinese will never complain about that. Certainly their government, you can be a murderous tyrant and we will sell you any weapons you want. And I know that Western countries have sometimes done the same, which of course is equally reprehensible, but they're not doing it now. They've at least moved in the right direction. So there's a very dark agenda of global dominance by China, which really has no truck with any notion of freedom, with freedom of expression, with fair trials, with freedom for torture or anything like that. The right to dissent, the right to vote. It's a one-party state. For forming a political party, you'll be sent to jail. That is an outright attack on people's liberty. To form your own party, promote your own views, that's a crime. This is shocking. It is not a crime. So my speech here is pro-Chinese and anti-regime. I would just like freedom for China as well elsewhere. As for Taiwan rejoining China, that's up to them. I'm not opposed to that. Most countries have accepted that, and I'm glad it's peaceful. And don't pretend this is benevolence on the part of the People's Republic of China. It's only because the United States is backing up Taiwan. And obviously China launched wars of aggression against Vietnam, against India, and so on. So they have not tried to resolve their differences peacefully. And despite being viciously anti-Muslim, they will also make friends with Pakistan just to try to have a counterweight to India. And it's India which is really the force for liberty and human rights in Asia. So for the reasons I've already adumbrated, I beg to oppose.